quite a severe head injury, but she was very much still alive on the back seat. And those people that caused the accident.
She was alive, just barely. Her head rested awkwardly against the back seat, a crimson stain spreading across her hair, and yet, despite the severity of her injuries, she was still breathing. The world outside seemed to have slowed. The rain, on the windshield, falling in relentless rhythm, each drop a tiny drumbeat marking the tension that gripped the night. The people responsible for the accident, those who should have been first to help, stood frozen, cameras in hand, capturing her suffering instead of offering aid. Every flash of the lens felt like a betrayal, a violation of something sacred and intimate. And somewhere, beyond the chaos of the road and the blaring sirens, those photographs were destined to make their way into the hands of news desks, replaying the moment over and over, each frame a frozen testament to negligence and cruelty. Inside Clarence's house, the night carried its own weight. It was not a night marked by royal announcements or glittering banquets. It was a night dominated by smoke, the kind that lingers long after the fire is gone, the kind that carries history in its bitter, acrid scent. Prince William had not been scheduled to be there that evening. Yet fate, with its strange, unyielding logic, had pulled him into the house at precisely the wrong, or perhaps right, moment. What he stepped into was a scene so surreal that even the most seasoned aides, those accustomed to the nuances of royal life, froze in disbelief. Camilla was there, alone, in a room that had been hidden from public eyes and staff alike. Flames licked the edges of the furniture, consuming items once cherished and now reduced to smoke and ash. A silk scarf, a handwritten letter, photographs curling and blackening, and something heavier, darker, almost tangible. The unspoken war over memory, over legacy, over the fragments of a life no one should have the power to erase. The corridors of Clarence's house seemed to shrink around the unfolding drama. Their silence, usually a comforting reminder of tradition and discretion, now felt oppressive, charged with anticipation. A narrow passageway past the Queen Mother's old drawing room led to a door that had been sealed for decades, a door that staff had long assumed led to nothing more than forgotten furniture and holiday decorations. But on that rainy Thursday evening, the hallway became the epicenter of a storm no one could have foreseen. The air was thick with the smell of burning fabric, smoke intertwining with the faint, lingering perfume that had been scattered across the estate for years. Oliver, a young assistant footman, had been delivering Earl Grey to Camilla's quarters when he noticed the scent. Curiosity, tinged with fear, drove him toward the source. His steps were hesitant, each one heavier than the last. The soft echo of his shoes against the polished floors punctuating the tension in the house. Then he saw it. The door, once securely locked, slightly ajar. Light flickered behind it, dancing like flames caught in a storm. His stomach twisted. This was not a fireplace or a controlled burn. This was deliberate. The air carried weight now, dense with intent. As he stepped closer, the smell of burning, silk and paper hit him in waves, almost choking him, and a sense of dread settled like a stone in his chest. He drew back, unsure whether to announce what he'd discovered or run. The choice was taken from him when the unthinkable happened. Prince William appeared in the hallway, returning unexpectedly from a charity event. His presence was unplanned, spontaneous yet charged with inevitability, as if the universe had conspired to place him at the precise point where history and memory collided. He was barely inside when Oliver approached, pale and hesitant, whispering words that seemed inadequate. Smoke, an open door, flickering light. William's frown deepened, a quiet storm gathering behind his eyes. Without hesitation, he moved toward the corridor, toward the unknown, where the fragile line between past and present was being violently rewritten. And in that moment, neither of them could have predicted the scene awaiting them, the room, the flames, and the choices made in darkness. Clarence House had always been a residence steeped in history, a labyrinth of polished corridors, silent, rooms and shadows that seemed to linger long after the daylight had faded. Each hallway held stories unspoken, moments remembered only by walls, carpets, and the faint scent of old wood and perfume. But one hallway, narrow and overlooked, carried a secret heavier than the rest. Its walls, lined with faded tapestries, and the muted portraits of ancestors long past, seemed to lean in, as though listening for the stories it had been forbidden to hear. The faint glow of candlelight reflected on the polished floors, exaggerating the quiet that had settled over the house like a protective shroud, or perhaps a warning. The door at the end of that hallway had remained sealed for decades, tucked, away beyond the Queen Mother's old drawing room. Most staff assumed it led to nothing more than discarded furniture, forgotten holiday decorations, or crates of archival materials. Few had ventured near it, and fewer still had keys. The door carried the kind of secrecy that demanded respect, an unspoken agreement that its contents belonged to the past, untouched and undisturbed. And yet, on this rainy Thursday evening, that assumption would be shattered. The rain outside drummed steadily against the tall windows of Clarence House, each drop adding to the tension in the air. The dim light from the stormy sky filtered through, heavy curtains, casting long shadows along the hallway. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the soft sigh of wind through the old stone walls. It was a silence that demanded attention, the kind of stillness that makes a person hyper-aware of every scent, every flicker of movement, every hint of something amiss. Oliver, the young footman, had been walking this hallway countless times, delivering tea, letters, or messages. Tonight, however, something felt different. The air carried an edge, a subtle tension that set his nerves on fire. And then came the smell, faint at first, almost dismissible but unmistakable, smoke, mingled with something familiar yet out of place. It was sweet and acrid at once, like burning silk, old parchment, and a hint of perfume long forgotten. It was a smell that didn't belong to any hearth or fireplace in the house. It carried intent, as though someone had taken the time to carefully select what would be consumed by the flames. The walls of the hallway, adorned with historical portraits and delicate moldings, seemed to close in around Oliver as he moved closer. He paused, heart pounding, glancing at the door at the end. It had always been locked, a silent sentinel guarding the memories and items it concealed. Tonight, however, it was slightly ajar, a thin line of flickering light spilling into the hallway, like a promise of revelation. The wood around the frame looked undisturbed, as if it had been pushed open carefully, almost reverently. Yet the air that escaped through the crack carried the unmistakable warmth of fire, mixed with the smell of fabric being devoured, paper curling into nothingness, and the faint metallic tang of history being rewritten. Clarence House, usually a place of order, now felt unpredictable, even dangerous. Its elegance, the polished floors, the gilded frames, and the quiet dignity of its interiors seemed to amplify the sense of intrusion, the violation of something sacred. Staff members, if they had been present, would have sensed it too, the sharp shift in the air, the sudden weight pressing on the chest, the knowledge that a line had been crossed that night. The walls themselves seemed to shiver, carrying the echoes of long-held agreements, quiet obedience, and unspoken boundaries that were about to be shattered. It was a house that demanded respect, yet it could not protect itself from what was happening within. The corridors that had once guided generations safely through their private lives now funneled a storm toward one narrow room, a hidden sanctuary of memory. Every step toward the door was a step into history being undone, every inch closer carried. The sense that time had condensed, that the past was colliding violently with the present. And as Oliver hesitated, staring at the flickering light and inhaling the acrid, perfumed smoke, it became clear. Whatever lay beyond that door would not be merely a secret uncovered. It would be a reckoning. The storm outside raged harder, wind rattling the windows, rain hammering the stone walls. Inside, the hallway's shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally, embracing the tension that pulsed with every heartbeat. It was a place of quiet majesty, yes, but also of vulnerability, a place where history could be honored or destroyed in a single moment. And on that night, Clarence House would witness both, hidden behind a door that no one had dared open for decades. The story of that night was not merely about fire or smoke. It was about the people who lived within those walls, the lives intertwined, with history, legacy, and unspoken emotion. At the center of it all stood Prince William, not yet fully prepared for the storm he was about to walk into. He had returned from a charity event, his presence unannounced, a young man caught between duty and personal grief. Calm, deliberate, yet aware of every nuance in the air, William carried the weight of memory on his shoulders. His mother's absence had carved deep grooves in his heart, grooves that had never healed. Every photograph, every object tied to Diana was a fragment of her presence, and he knew instinctively that some things were more fragile than glass. On this night, those fragments would be tested. Oliver, the young footman, was the first to sense that something was wrong. Nervous and hesitant, he had worked in Clarence House for only a few years, yet he knew the significance of the sealed corridors and locked rooms. Every step he took toward the ajar door felt heavy with responsibility he had not asked for. His mind raced with questions. Who would risk entering this room? What would they do? The smoke curling into the hallway seemed almost alive, pulling him closer, demanding he act. And yet, the fear of being wrong, of misjudging the situation, kept him rooted in place. He was a witness, and witnesses in Clarence House often held the line between discretion and disaster. And then there was Camilla, standing at the center of the storm that no one had foreseen. She moved with quiet precision, her hands steady over the fire bin as she fed it carefully chosen items, silk scarves, photographs, letters. The flames licked her fingers as if testing her, yet she did not flinch. Her expression was controlled, almost unreadable, but her intent was unmistakable. This was a woman who had lived decades in the shadow of another, a shadow that carried both love and resentment, admiration and jealousy. For her, the act of burning was not mere destruction. It was a statement, a reclamation of space, a rewriting of history in a language made of fire and smoke. The staff, scattered and largely unseen, were silent observers. They had served both Diana and Camilla, navigating the delicate intricacies of palace life, balancing loyalty and discretion. Elizabeth, a longtime aide, had been present for decades, her eyes trained to notice the subtle shifts in atmosphere and expression. She sensed the enormity of what was happening even before she reached the room. Each crackle of fire, each curl of smoke carried meaning. It was a betrayal not just of objects but of trust, of the memories that bound the royal family together. Others would follow, drawn by sound or instinct, each adding their own weight to the growing tension. Yet none could alter the inevitability of what William was about to witness. Even the objects themselves seemed to possess character. A torn photograph of Diana and Harry lay discarded near the embers, a sapphire earring glinting faintly in the dim light. Every item had its own history, its own story of touch, scent, and presence. And every object that Camilla had chosen to burn carried a significance beyond the obvious, personal, intimate, irretrievable. In this way, the house itself became a character, the rooms alive with emotion and memory. the air thick with anticipation and dread. Together, these figures, William, Oliver, Camilla, the staff, and even the objects, formed a delicate web of tension, history, and conflict. Each movement, each glance, each step carried weight. The drama was not in the fire alone, but in the relationships it exposed, in the silent battles of memory and control. And as William stepped further into the hallway, the smells of smoke and fabric curling around him, the weight of the moment settled fully onto his shoulders. He was not just witnessing history, he was standing at the threshold of a choice, a confrontation, and a revelation that would change everything. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as William moved toward the source of the smoke. Every step echoed against the polished floors, a muted drumbeat marking his approach. The flickering light from the slightly ajar door danced across the walls, casting elongated shadows of him and Oliver, who followed hesitantly behind. The air grew heavier with every step, thick with heat and the scent of burning fabric, paper, and the faintest trace of perfume that William recognized instantly as his mother's. It was a smell that carried decades of memory, of laughter, of whispered confidences in rooms long gone. And now it was mingled with destruction, curling and choking in the air. The door, slightly warped from years of neglect and secrecy, creaked ominously as William pushed it open further. What he saw inside stopped him cold. Camilla stood at the center of a small, dimly lit room, her posture rigid, hair pinned back, cashmere shawl draped perfectly over her shoulders. In her hands were a pair of tongs, steady despite the flames that danced beneath the items she held. Silk scarves, photographs curling at the edges, letters blackening at the corners. All were chosen with intention, and all were disappearing, into smoke and ash. The fire bin, antique and worn, seemed almost alive, responding to the objects as if recognizing the weight of their history. William's eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail. A torn photograph of Diana and Harry, the faint glint of a sapphire earring on the floor, a leather-bound book reduced to curling, brittle pages. Nothing was random. Every object held significance, and every flame was deliberate. The room, normally quiet and controlled, now felt like a battlefield between past and present. Oliver remained frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. His mind raced, cataloging every object in his line of sight. Each was a relic of Diana's life. Personal items that had been preserved, locked away, untouched for years. The magnitude of what was happening began to settle on him like a physical weight. These were not trivial possessions. They were fragments of a woman's life, carefully collected, cherished, and now being erased before their eyes. William's approach was slow but deliberate, his presence filling the room with an authority that could not be ignored. He did not speak immediately. His eyes roamed, taking in the scorched edges of fabric, the curling photographs, and the fragile remnants of letters. He bent slightly to inspect a partially burned diary page, recognizing his mother's handwriting instantly. "I felt peace, today," the words read, blurred but legible. The sentence, incomplete and fragmented by flame, struck him with the force of grief, raw and immediate. This was more than destruction. It was a deliberate attempt to rewrite memory itself. Camilla looked up, meeting William's gaze with a mixture of defiance and something darker, harder to define. She did not flinch, did not stumble over words. Her hands hovered briefly over the flames, then placed another item inside with precise care. There was a rhythm to her actions, a silent determination. "Some things are better left in the past," she said softly, her voice steady, almost serene. But for William, the past was not something that could simply be burned away. Each object carried the imprint of his mother's presence, the touch of her hand, the scent of her perfume, the echo of her voice. The tension in the room grew nearly palpable. The air seemed to vibrate with unspoken emotions, grief, anger, fear, and betrayal. William's eyes never left the fire, yet he observed everything, the way Camilla's jaw tightened, the small tremor in her fingers, the faintest hesitation before she selected the next item. The staff had begun to arrive silently, their footsteps hesitant on the polished floor, drawn by the smell of smoke and the unusual flickering light. One by one, they paused in the doorway, their expressions moving from curiosity to shock, horror, and disbelief. Elizabeth, the longtime aide, stepped forward, her eyes wide as they fell upon the bin. She recognized the items instantly, the torn photographs, the personal letters, the silk scarves. Each had been chosen with care by Diana, preserved as relics of her life. Now, blackened and curling, they were disappearing into the flames, irretrievable and irrevocable. She let out a soft gasp, and in that sound, William felt the weight of what was being destroyed. This was not carelessness, it was intentional. The room seemed to pulse with the fire's rhythm, embers dancing like living entities around Camilla's hands. William finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying authority but restrained emotion. "What are you doing?" The words were simple, but they cut through the heat and smoke like a blade. Camilla paused, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in her expression, only a calm determination that made the confrontation all the more intense. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the crackle of fire and the collective breath of those who watched, frozen by the scene before them. Every item in the room seemed to cry out for recognition. A single ballet slipper, charred at the toe, reminded William of private moments from his childhood, rehearsals that had been witnessed only by family. A torn page from a diary held memories of words his mother had written in private, expressions of hope, love, and fleeting joy. And then, the letter addressed to Harry, its envelope blackened yet still intact, containing a fragment of advice and tenderness that now felt violently interrupted. Each piece was deliberate, chosen for destruction. The pattern was undeniable. William took a slow step closer, his shoes brushing against the scorched edge of a photograph on the floor. Every movement was measured, controlled, a counterbalance to the chaos around him. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. And in that moment, the fire was not just consuming objects, it was consuming the room, the air, and the unspoken tension that had been building for decades. History, legacy, and personal memory were all intertwined, and every second brought them closer to being irrevocably altered. William's eyes never left Camilla as the smoke curled between them, thick and pungent, carrying with it the weight of decades. Time seemed to stretch and bend in that narrow room, the only sound the slow crackle of the flames consuming objects he had once considered untouchable, sacred fragments of his mother's life. Camilla stood motionless, her hands poised above the fire bin, holding another silk scarf ready to join the flames. Her gaze met his, unwavering, almost defiant, as though challenging him to intervene. Too calm, William thought, his chest tightening. Too composed for someone committing this act. Every muscle in his body was taut with restrained fury, grief, and disbelief. For a brief moment, he could barely recognize her, not as the woman who had been a stepmother in name, but as a stranger who had crossed an unthinkable line. The room itself seemed to tremble under the intensity of their silent confrontation. The air was heavy with smoke, with memory, with the raw, unspoken tension that had been building for years. Now, erupting in this confined space, what are you doing? His voice was steady, measured, but every word carried the force of an accusation. The quiet precision of his tone made the words sharper, each syllable deliberate, cutting through the haze like a blade. Camilla did not flinch. Instead, she placed, the scarf in the fire, watching the silk curl and blacken before responding. "Some things are better left in the past," she said softly. Her words floated in the smoke-filled room, almost serene but loaded with meaning. William's jaw tightened. The past wasn't something that could simply be erased by flame. These objects were more than fabric or paper. They were remnants of his mother's presence, of love, memory, and history. To see them reduced to ash felt like a personal violation, a theft of legacy. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, as though asserting control over the room, over the chaos, over the intangible weight of memory. His eyes swept across the bin, taking in every object: the partially burned diary page, the torn photographs, the letter to Harry. Each one carried the imprint of Diana's life, her handwriting, her touch, her essence, and each had been chosen intentionally for destruction. The act was deliberate, calculated, and the message was unmistakable. The staff began arriving, moving quietly, unsure how to intervene. Their presence added a new layer of tension, their faces masks of shock and horror. Elizabeth, the long-time aide, froze when she recognized the items in the fire bin. Her gasp was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to underscore the gravity of the situation. These were not mere trinkets or discarded objects. These were relics of Diana's life, personal fragments now being obliterated in a single, controlled act. William turned his attention fully to Camilla. "I gave no permission for this," he said, his voice now low but firm, weighted with authority and grief. No one did. Each word carried the finality of a judgment, but it also left room for explanation, for truth, for accountability. Camilla's eyes met his, and for a fleeting second there was a flicker of emotion. Defiance mixed with something more elusive, a hint of guilt, a whisper of understanding that the act she was committing could never be fully justified in his eyes. She straightened, her composure unshaken, yet her gaze revealed layers he could not ignore. Resentment built over decades, living in a shadow that had never fully been hers, and a determination to carve out control in a space where her influence had always been limited. And yet, in that room, the weight of William's presence, of his silent authority, pressed down on her. For the first time, she paused. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the crackle of flames, the faint scent of scorched silk, and the unspoken acknowledgement of what was at stake. William stepped closer to the fire bin, careful not to disturb the fragile remnants. A partially burned ballet slipper caught his eye, a fragment of a memory he had treasured in his childhood, now marred by smoke and heat. He bent to pick it up, the ribbon still twisted, the edges scorched. Each item he recovered was like reclaiming a piece of his past, a fragment of a life that had been stolen in more ways than one. A torn photograph of Diana at Balmoral, smiling, holding Harry close, lay scorched at the corner of the bin. He gently cradled it, his fingers trembling slightly, the weight of both grief and anger pressing down on him. Why? His question was quieter now, almost lost beneath the roar of the storm outside and the subtle hiss of the flames. But it carried everything he felt: anger, disbelief, sorrow, and the desperate need for understanding. Camilla's response was measured, almost rehearsed. It was time. Time to let go, to move forward. But the words rang hollow in the smoke-filled room. Time, for William, had never meant forgetting. It had meant remembering, preserving, and honoring. The confrontation reached its peak when the staff, guided by William's authority, began carefully removing the partially burned items. Each retrieval was slow, deliberate, reverent. They handled the fragile remnants with gloved hands, understanding the magnitude of what had occurred. William observed, his face a mask of controlled emotion, yet inside, a storm raged. The fire, had been more than flames. It had been a declaration, a challenge to memory and legacy. And while the physical destruction could be mitigated, the emotional scar would linger far longer than any ash. By the time Camilla stepped back, her hands empty, her composure intact, the room was a tableau of destruction and reclamation. William's presence had halted further devastation, but the consequences of the act were already etched into the very air, thick with smoke, grief, and unresolved tension. He walked to the side table, opening a wooden box that remained untouched by fire. Inside were a few remaining treasures: a brooch, a dried flower, fragments of speech notes, reminders that some pieces of memory could still be preserved. In that moment, the confrontation ended, but the impact did not. Words had been spoken, choices had been made, and the room now stood as a testament to the collision of intent and legacy, past and present. The confrontation was over, yet the fire it had sparked would burn long beyond the walls of Clarence House.